Good afternoon and welcome back, Criminal Files, to another episode of Homicide Cases. I'm your host, Misfit, and today I will be opening the file on Quincy Allen, an American serial killer with 4 known victims. Quincy Allen, born November 7, 1979, is an American serial killer who perpetrated a rapid and geographically dispersed crime spree across South Carolina and North Carolina in the summer of 2002. Allen was ultimately responsible for the deaths of 4 people and the assault and battery of several others. Crimes characterized by extreme violence, disorganized motivation, and post mortem defilement. The legal proceedings resulted in a bifurcated disposition. Allen received a life sentence in North Carolina for the double homicide there, but he was initially sentenced to death in South Carolina for the homicides of Dale Hall and Jedediah Hart. Allen spent nearly 2 decades on South Carolina's death row until 2022, when his capital sentence was vacated by the United States Court of Appeals for the Fourth Circuit. The federal appellate court ruled that the state trial judge had failed to give meaningful constitutional consideration to extensive and largely uncontested mitigating evidence, specifically concerning Allen's severe childhood abuse and documented mental illness, therefore violating the Eighth Amendment. Faced with the mandate for a new, constitutionally compliant sentencing trial, South Carolina prosecutors accepted a resolution in July 2024. This final disposition saw Allen's death sentence commuted to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, an agreement contingent upon Allen waiving all future appellate rights. The time elapsed, 22 years since the crimes were committed, underscores the profound legal and judicial challenges inherent in capital cases, particularly when due process failures regarding mitigation are identified at the state level. The state's decision to forego a renewed death penalty pursuit in favor of a final, unappealable life sentence demonstrates a legal prioritization of case resolution and finality. Quincy Allen's crime spree spanned approximately 6 weeks, exhibiting a pattern that rapidly escalated into violence and disorganized in the choice of victims and motive. Allen's initial motivation for acquiring a weapon and beginning his campaign of violence stemmed from a highly distorted and delusional source. During a prior incarceration in federal prison for vehicle theft, Allen reported that a fellow inmate had promised him a job as a mafia hitman. Upon his release, Allen grew impatient waiting for the promised position and decided to purchase a shotgun to begin practicing for his intended career. The self-stated, pathologically driven reason for initiating violence is crucial to understanding the psychological context of his future crimes. The spree commenced on July 7, 2002 in Columbia, South Carolina. Allen approached 51-year-old James White, a homeless man sleeping on a swinging bench in Finlay Park. Allen ordered White to stand up and then shot him in the shoulder. When White collapsed, Allen ordered him back up and shot him a second time. White survived the attack, and Allen was later convicted of assault and battery with intent to kill for this offense. Allen later confessed to police that he had used White as a practice victim because he had just acquired the shotgun and was unfamiliar with its use. This act demonstrates an alarming level of depersonalization and a calculated yet disorganized initiation into lethal violence. A few days later, on July 10, 2002, Allen took the life of 45-year-old Dale Hall, a prostitute he met on Two Notch Road in Columbia, South Carolina. Allen drove Hall to an isolated cul-de-sac near I-77. As Hall pleaded for her life, Allen shot her 3 times with a 12-gauge shotgun, placing the barrel in her mouth for the fatal shot. After the homicide, Allen purchased a can of gasoline from a nearby truck stop, returned to the location, and doused Hall's body and set it on fire. The use of post-mortem arson, classified as arson in the second degree, adds a layer of extreme defilement to the crime. Following this homicide and arson, Allen returned to his job at the Texas Roadhouse Grill restaurant. The nature of the violence escalated significantly on August 8, 2002, when the crime spree transitioned from random targeting to targeted violence stemming from a workplace conflict. While working at the Texas Roadhouse, Allen argued with 2 sisters, Tiffany and Tennille Todd. He severely threatened Tiffany, who was pregnant. This led to a confrontation with Tiffany's boyfriend, Brian Marquis. Allen fired his shotgun at Marquis' car but missed, instead fatally striking Marquis' friend, 22-year-old Jedediah Harr, in the right side of the head. Harr died instantly. Following the shooting, Allen pursued Marquis, who sought refuge in a convenience store. Allen then abandoned the chase and proceeded to set fire to the front porch of Marquis' home. The spree continued with acts of arson the following day, August 9, 2002, when Allen set fire to the car of another Texas Roadhouse employee, Sarah Barnes, and then randomly burned the car of a stranger, Don Bundrick, a few minutes later. This rapid shift in methodology from experimental killing to retaliatory homicide and later acts of wanton destruction demonstrates a diminishing mental state and a complete loss of impulse control over a 38-day period, a volatility highly consistent with the later diagnosis of severe pathology. Allen eventually left South Carolina. On August 12, 2002, while traveling, he committed a double homicide during a robbery at a Citgo gas station in Dobson, North Carolina. The victims were 53-year-old Richard Hawks and 29-year-old Robert Roush. These killings resulted in convictions for first-degree homicide, robbery with a dangerous weapon, and larceny in North Carolina. The crime spree ended 2 days later, on August 14, 2002, when Allen was apprehended by authorities while sleeping in an abandoned car in Mitchell County, Texas. The multi-jurisdictional nature of the crimes ultimately led to 2 separate legal outcomes. The core of the legal challenge to Quincy Allen's death sentence rested upon the vast documentation of his lifelong mental illness and severe childhood trauma, evidence that the federal courts later determined to be unconstitutionally dismissed during the original sentencing phase. The defense presented abundant evidence of Allen's background, which was characterized as a history of horrible abusive childhood and significant childhood history of abuse and neglect. This profile of severe trauma was stated to be virtually all undisputed by both the defense and the prosecution experts. Specific acts of abuse documented in the record painted a picture of profound parental abandonment. Allen's mother began kicking him out of the house when he was only in the 4th grade, forcing him to sleep in dangerous and makeshift locations such as bushes, a friend's tree house, or a McDonald's playground. Furthermore, Allen was subjected to severe psychological abuse from his stepfather, who once pointed an empty gun at Allen's head and pulled the trigger. This history illustrates a profound failure of the primary support system, directly contributing to Allen's inability to cope with or manage his escalating mental health crisis outside of institutional settings. The record of mental health issues predates the 2002 crime spree. Allen had a lifelong history of mental illness marked by erratic behaviors, suicide attempts, and multiple admissions into institutions. Critically, prior to the killings that occurred when Allen was 22, he had been admitted to psychiatric hospitals 7 times in 5 years, either voluntarily or involuntarily. One significant incident highlights the depth of his family's neglect. After Allen threatened suicide by attempting to jump a roof, police were called and they contacted his mother. She arrived hours later, laughed at the situation, and walked away. This response demonstrates a level of institutional failure and abandonment that worsened Allen's severe mental health issues. During the sentencing phase, extensive psychiatric testimony was provided. Three forensic psychiatrists independently diagnosed Allen with schizophrenia. Defense experts noted they considered the possibility of malingering, which is faking symptoms, but definitively concluded that Allen was genuinely schizophrenic. One expert hypothesized that the severe stress associated with the crime spree itself had caused the expression of his schizophrenia to become dangerous. Furthermore, the severity of the illness was evident in his pharmacologic treatment. Dr. Schwartz-Watts noted Allen was prescribed the highest dose of the antipsychotic medication Geodon. Even the prosecution psychiatrist Dr. James Ballinger noted in 2004 that Allen was on mountains of antipsychotic medications at this point. Psychiatrists from both sides suggested that the crimes were not committed solely by a calculated, rational criminal mind, but rather by an individual whose judgment and impulse control were critically compromised by severe, documented pathology exacerbated by trauma, thus establishing a compelling argument for criminal culpability as a mitigating factor. The complex legal disposition resulted in radically divergent judicial outcomes for Allen's crimes. While North Carolina acknowledged Allen's mental illness and sentenced him to life imprisonment for the August 12th double homicide, South Carolina's capital sentencing process was later determined to be constitutionally flawed. In South Carolina, Allen pled guilty to 2 counts of homicide, multiple counts of arson, assault and battery with intent to kill, and pointing a firearm. He waived his right to a jury sentencing, placing the decision in the hands of the presiding judge, G. Thomas Cooper. Following a 10-day sentencing hearing that included testimony from both defense and prosecution mental health experts, Judge Cooper sentenced Allen to death in March of 2005 for the homicides of Dale Hall and Jedediah Hart. Despite the overwhelming evidence of trauma and illness, Judge Cooper found zero mitigating circumstances. The judge acknowledged that there was a significant issue about mental illness during the hearing. However, the judge's rationale, later detailed in a post-sentencing affidavit, revealed a crucial legal error. The judge determined that evidence could only be considered mitigating if it rose to the level of establishing that Allen was so mentally ill throughout the time of his crimes and was so mentally ill at the time of the trial that imposition of the death penalty would violate the Eighth Amendment ban on cruel and unusual punishment. This sentencing decision imposed an unconstitutional burden of proof, effectively requiring the mitigating evidence to meet the high legal bar for a finding of insanity or incompetence before it could be afforded any judicial weight. This fundamentally contradicted established Eighth Amendment jurisprudence, which requires capital sentences to consider as a mitigating factor any aspect of the defendant's character or record and any circumstances of the offense that might serve as a basis for a sentence less than death. The tension between the judicial outcomes, North Carolina granting life based on an explicit finding of mental illness, and South Carolina rejecting the same evidence as mitigation, demonstrated the arbitrary application of sentencing standards concerning Allen's history. The South Carolina trial court's action of demanding near insanity for mitigation to be acknowledged meant that the court failed to properly consider evidence highly relevant to the defendant's unique circumstances, rendering the sentence vulnerable to federal review. The constitutional deficiencies in the South Carolina capital sentencing were formally addressed by the United States Court of Appeals for the Fourth Circuit in 2022. On July 26, 2022, the Fourth Circuit reversed the district court's dismissal and vacated Allen's death sentence in a 2-1 ruling. Although the court was operating under the stringent deferential standard of the Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act, it found that the state court's determination was fundamentally flawed. Chief Judge Roger Gregory, writing for the majority, concluded that the state court's ruling that the trial judge properly considered Allen's mitigation evidence was both an unreasonable determination of the facts and contrary to clearly established federal law. The fundamental error was the trial judge's failure to give meaningful consideration to the defendant's background and character, which is a constitutional prerequisite for individualized sentencing in capital cases. The Fourth Circuit determined that Judge Cooper did not simply give the mitigating evidence little weight, as might be permissible under law. Rather, he effectively excluded, ignored, or overlooked Allen's clear and undisputed mitigating evidence, thereby eviscerating the well-established requirements of due process. The court asserted that by requiring the evidence to meet the high legal bar of proving the defendant's constitutional protection against execution, near insanity, the judge erected a legal barrier that ensured the evidence was afforded no weight. This refusal to acknowledge the existence of relevant mitigating evidence violated the principle laid out in Lockett v. Ohio and Eddings v. Oklahoma. By finding the state court's conclusion to be unreasonable under the AEDPA, the Fourth Circuit reaffirmed its oversight role in protecting fundamental constitutional rights. The court's decision serves as a powerful reminder to state judiciaries that mitigating evidence concerning mental illness and trauma must first be acknowledged and considered constitutionally, reinforcing the strict requirements for individualized sentencing and limiting judicial discretion to dismiss psychiatric evidence that falls short of a formal finding of legal insanity. The court remanded the case, instructing the district court to issue a writ of habeas corpus unless South Carolina granted Allen a new, constitutionally sound sentencing hearing within a reasonable time. This ruling effectively compelled the state to revisit its capital sentence under the correct legal parameters. The 2022 federal ruling created a strategic challenge for the South Carolina prosecutors to pursue a costly, complex new sentencing trial where the validated mitigating evidence of childhood abuse and schizophrenia would likely preclude a death sentence or negotiate a final resolution. The state ultimately chose the path of finality. In July 2024, Allen accepted a plea deal that commuted his death sentence to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. This resolution was signed. This outcome represents a pragmatic decision by the state. While certain law enforcement officials, such as Richard County Sheriff Leon Lott, publicly voiced disappointment, characterizing Allen as a high-risk individual who is a terror in the prison system and warns that he will kill again because he likes it. The legal reality favored commutation. A second sentencing hearing would have been prolonged, expensive, and carried significant risk of judicial error leading back to the federal courts. This life sentence, coupled with the waiver of appeal, ensured permanent incarceration and resolution for the state. Quincy Allen, currently 44 years old, is imprisoned at the Broad River Correctional Institution in Columbia, South Carolina. His legal status has transitioned from death sentence inmate to one serving life imprisonment without parole. Allen's commutation contributes to the notable reduction in South Carolina's death row population, reflecting both the successful application of constitutional law and the changing legal landscape regarding capital punishment. The case presents a critical dual narrative regarding culpability. The legal system, guided by the Eighth Amendment, validated the psychiatric findings and trauma history as factors mitigating against the ultimate penalty. This acknowledgement diminished culpability stemming from severe illness and neglect. Conversely, the public safety perspective, exemplified by Sheriff Lott's statement, frames Allen as a predatory, high-risk offender. The judicial resolution aligns with the constitutional requirement to incorporate the defendant's background, ensuring that the death penalty is not imposed arbitrarily upon an impaired individual. The case of Quincy Allen is a definitive illustration of the constitutional guarantee against the arbitrary imposition of the death penalty. Allen's crime spree was characterized by extraordinary impulsivity and violence, yet the legal defense successfully established a fundamental link between his actions and lifelong history of severe, undisputed childhood abuse and documented schizophrenia. The Fourth Circuit's ruling served to correct the fundamental judicial error of the South Carolina trial court, which had imposed an unconstitutional burden by requiring mitigation evidence to achieve the standard of legal insanity before it could be considered. By insisting on a meaningful consideration of Allen's character and history, the appellate court reaffirmed the continued vitality of capital punishment jurisprudence, ensuring that individualized sentencing remains a cornerstone of the Eighth Amendment. The ultimate resolution, life imprisonment without parole, ensures permanent societal protection from an extremely dangerous individual while simultaneously resolving the decades-long conflict over the constitutional validity of the original death sentence. This outcome validates the principle that even for horrific crimes, the unique background and pathological state of the defendant must be comprehensively addressed, confirming that the initial death sentence was an unconstitutional error derived from the misapplication of sentencing standards to uncontested psychiatric facts. That concludes this episode of Homicide Cases. As I close the file on Quincy Allen, join me next time when I will open a file on Ronald Ulrich. This is Misfit signing off, and as always, stay safe.